Tonight, it's a very great pleasure for me to introduce my dear friend, Father Bill Dailey, who is a man of many talents. He's a professor, lecturer in the law school. He's the rector at Stanford Hall. He's the Thomas More Fellow at the Center for Ethics and Culture. He's a great priest, a great homilist, a great mind, a great friend. Not just to me, but also to Notre Dame and to you as well. And he's going to offer some comments this evening that are especially potent and poignant given this moment in our nation's history and in our shared history together.
Prior to his work at Notre Dame, Father Bill was a scholar in residence at Columbia Law School, an associate at the Wiley Rand law firm in Washington, D.C., and a law clerk to a federal judge in Portland, Oregon. Father Bill's priestly and legal career has always openly stood for the protection of the weakest in our society and the most vulnerable, including the unborn. In addition to these roles, Father Bill is also my rector in Stanford Hall. Please welcome Father Bill Dailey.
Thank you for that overly generous introduction, but it's what you should do since I am your rector. Among my clients at Wiley Ryan were like the Pfizer Pharmaceutical Corporation. I'm not sure all of my work was devoted to the poor and defenseless, but I did my best to be ethical there. A lot of rules in life are not exceptionless norms, though we'll speak of some exceptionless norms tonight. It is true that in general, we invite esteemed members of the campus community to give this talk. They did invite an esteemed member of the campus community to give this talk, and my understanding is he was not available, and so you get me. I didn't know what to say, so I thought about the context in which we gather. We gather in the Lenten season, which is propitious. It's the right time for a Bread of Life dinner because the Lenten season is when we pause and in a particular and systematic way in our practice and in our thoughts to aim toward life. It is our season as a people wherein we're particularly focused on the proper celebration of the feast of Easter. So there couldn't be anything more, any time, any season more appropriate for our gathering. And that thought of context is what has stuck with me. So I'm just going to give a smattering of impressionistic remarks about context. If you are foolish enough to waste time on Twitter and even more foolish to waste time on my Twitter feed, some of you will have noticed that I'm not excited about everything that's happening in the world right now. Perhaps you are. Maybe America is soon to be great again, but other things occur to me as possibilities. And one bit of context for that is I walked over to the law school today for a meeting with an associate dean, and anyone on the faculty here, you know how much joy such words bring, right? But I walked out of Stanford, and it's really beautiful, this campus today. Like the snow, I mean, yesterday was about as ugly as a day gets, and I had to walk out into that sleet a bunch of times, but it paid off, right? And I thought to myself, and because one doesn't have private thoughts, I tweeted, when life is bad, it's nice to have a beautiful walk to work. So I just want to throw that out. Now, about life being bad. It was Saturday, a couple of weeks ago, that I finished celebrating Mass very happily for a great group of law students at our annual law school retreat. And as I had taken off my vestments and was walking out of Como, I opened Twitter, and a tweet appeared that Justice Scalia was dead in Texas. And it was from mysanantonio.com or something that someone had retweeted. So the first hope was, as is often the case, this is false. This will be a false report. But I walked back in and I grabbed the law students because I knew them, and I knew many of them to be fond of Justice Scalia and of what he has meant for the law. And we stopped and we prayed, and as a student of the law, I can say that Justice Scalia was enormously important to my formation and my thinking about the law. And some of my greatest colleagues were personally formed by him as law clerks, and so I have seen the fruits of his labors and benefited by it in that way as well. And even if I thought he was a nasty person and I didn't care for any of those things, there is a fact that surely is on many of our minds tonight, which is that with the death of Justice Scalia in pure power political terms, the Supreme Court stands at an extraordinary juncture. We have lost one of what were presumed to be, though not certain to be, 4 votes. His was known to be a vote to overturn Roe versus Wade. His vote for the modest proposition that the Constitution does not empower the federal judiciary to involve itself in the question of the taking of unborn human life. You may have noticed that people in Washington are having quite a row over that empty seat, which is currently shrouded in black muslin. If the party that is not dedicated, even nominally, to the preservation of unborn human life wins this election in the fall, if not before, they'll get to replace Justice Scalia. I don't think the Democratic Party is as good at doing many of the things it thinks it's good at as it might imagine, but one thing they are certain to be infallible at is finding a judge who will vote to uphold Roe versus Wade. Justice Kennedy is just a little bit younger than Justice Scalia was. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, likely to be replaced. Justice Breyer's been on the court for a long time, so it's quite conceivable that the next president can create a legal context in which something that many of us have seen ourselves as working for and hoping for and praying for and might just be imminent, indeed seems to have been true for about 10 minutes at the Supreme Court when Casey was once decided before it was redecided with a change of a vote by Justice Kennedy, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. It might just be off the table. It might just be, right? If this election goes one way and a few retirements or resignations from the court go as one might naturally expect them to, given the givens of human life and frailty, that situation is a massive one. I'm not here to stump for any candidate, but simply to recognize that the context in which we meet for a Bread of Life dinner, which is always about more than the issue of the life of the unborn, but always including our thoughts on that issue, it's an extraordinary and fraught time, and not necessarily an encouraging one. Here's another issue that you might have noticed if you read the Washington Post. A friend of mine sent this to me yesterday. This was from Charles Lane, and it's a little pause to look at the Netherlands and their physician-assisted suicide regime. I'll just read a couple of paragraphs here. In early childhood, the Dutch psychiatric patient known as 2014-77 suffered neglect and abuse. When he was about 10, doctors diagnosed him with autism. For approximately 2 decades thereafter, he was in and out of treatment and made repeated suicide attempts. He suffered terribly, doctors later observed, from his inability to form relationships. He responded to matters in a spontaneous and intense, sometimes even extreme way. This led to problems. A few years ago, 2014-77 asked a psychiatrist to end his life. In the Netherlands, doctors may perform euthanasia, not only for terminal physical illness, but also upon the, quote, voluntary and well-considered, end quote, request of those suffering, quote, unbearably from incurable mental conditions. This doctor declined, citing his belief that the case was treatable, as well as his own moral qualms, but he did transmit the request to his colleagues as Dutch legal norms require. They treated the patient for 1 more year, determined his case was indeed hopeless, and in due course administered a fatal dose of drugs. Thus did a man in his 30s, whose only diagnosis was autism, become one of 110 people to be euthanized for mental disorders in the Netherlands between 2011 and 2014, the rough equivalent of 2,000 people in the United States, if one were to compare populations. That's a bit of context. I spoke that we've gathered at gatherings like this in most of my lifetime with a certain kind of optimism that with a little bit of persuasion, with some electoral political luck, And with some better jurisprudence at the Supreme Court, we might get over the hump and overturn Roe versus Wade. Another part of that optimism that some of us have, and some of us were discussing at lunch yesterday, I apologize to them because they're going to hear a difficult story for a second time. Another bit of optimism that we have, and it's good optimism for university people, is that for many of us, the logic of the life of the unborn is clear logic, and we believe that reason is a gift to human beings, and we believe in its vindication. And so we're optimistic that when people understand what's at stake, and when they understand biology, the facts are on our side, and facts are stubborn things, and so life should find a way. Early on in my priesthood, actually before I was ordained, it was in my seminary formation, I was sent by Father Miss Campbell and others on our seminary staff to a wonderful summer in Boston, very near the Prudential Center. I lived at St. Cecilia Parish downtown. It was an easy walk to Fenway Park, and it was a beautiful summer. There's really fewer places to spend a great summer or few places that are better than Boston to spend a summer. I got to go to some Red Sox games and enjoy the wonderful Boston Pops on the 4th of July with their music synchronized with fireworks. There were a lot of wonderful and graced moments there. There were also a couple of days I was there for the summer to work as a member of a clinical pastoral education program. It's a chaplaincy training program, and we were at a Harvard teaching hospital. The pinnacle of education and learning in America is Harvard, as you may know. We're trying harder to be like them all the time. And this was one of their best hospitals, the Brigham and Women's Hospital. It also had the distinction of being Massachusetts' busiest abortion clinic. And you might imagine in a state with strong Catholic traditions, such as Massachusetts, and in particular the city of Boston had, a natural and correct inference from that fact is that it would be an abortion clinic where many Catholics would avail themselves of what are called services there. And so they did, and so they would contact chaplaincy. I can tell you of two stories, one very brief and the other a bit more to the point I was making, but both set a context for us. One time I can recall being called over after a woman had an abortion, never learned her name, she didn't wish it to be shared, never met her, she didn't wish to meet anyone, but she wanted it to be known that she was Catholic, that she felt bad, and that she would like me to pray over the child whom she had aborted. And the way that this was accommodated at this premier medical institution run by our nation's premier educational institution was that I went into the nurse's break room, and there was a nurse over here talking to a friend, having some lunch, as was their right. Another one had pulled a curtain around. She was on a phone call. And there was a table in the middle of the room that would ordinarily have been used for papers or to set down one's personal effects, perhaps. It had on it a Tupperware container with a number on the top. And I was told this was the place for whatever liturgical solemnizing I could come up with. And so I prayed for a woman I didn't know, a father that wasn't even a part of the picture, and a child, whether boy or girl, that no one would ever get to meet. On another occasion, much more involved and complicated that goes to this point, a couple had called for chaplaincy services a few weeks before I got the call to say that they had faced a conundrum because the doctors had said the child in the mother's womb was whom they wanted and had celebrated, and they were 17 weeks along, was likely to be born with either or both Down syndrome or spinal bifida, and the question that inevitably flows from that, with the implication that you should say no, is do you wish to continue? In the context of such medical pressure, despite having had a wonderful young chaplaincy intern along with me, a Catholic woman who was blind, who visited them with a seeing eye dog, and who, as you might imagine, gave them her most impassioned plea that a child born with birth defects was every bit as worthy and deserving of life as the rest of us, but she didn't succeed. They called on a Monday and said, we've begun the process of having an abortion. We would like either the priest, who was on vacation at the time, or the seminarian that we've heard is here. We want one of the two Catholics to meet us at the hospital. We know that he won't approve of what we're doing, but we want him to pray for our son because we love our son, and we know that he's allowed to pray for our son, and that's what we'd like to have. And a couple things about that. In a hospital, I prayed with atheists and with Muslims and with Southern Baptists and high Anglicans. No one in a hospital really cares who's coming to visit them. They're lonely, they're sick, you're not coming to poke or prod them. People don't really care much unless they want to receive communion or the sacraments about the denomination of the person who's coming. So the request that they wanted to have a Catholic minister who they knew couldn't be one that would approve of what they were doing was a strange request indeed, and suggested to me that however much they might have intended their verbal formulation, we know he won't be endorsing what we're doing as true. I couldn't but be endorsing what they were doing if I stayed with them the whole day. So I didn't, and I won't get into all of the complications of that, but they called after the abortion. I had offered to meet them in the chapel to help them work with the doctors not to continue a course that they had set forth, but which was likely reversible, and told them that that's what I would be praying for. They didn't choose to avail themselves of that service. They did have the abortion. They called afterwards to see if I would come and meet with them, which I did. At which time they explained to me that they loved their son, that they were naming him after his father, and that they had wanted me to be with them rather than their parish priest because they didn't want him to have a complicated and difficult time celebrating the funeral that they planned to have when they told him that they had lost their child. That sticks with me because it goes against our sense of optimism, that if people just really knew this was a human being, if they knew it was a child, they'd agree with us, they'd come around. And so we just need more bumper stickers that say it's a child, not a choice. And we can cut through the tissue of lies, which indeed they are, around the rhetoric of choice, and we'll win. But these people weren't confused about that. They were more like the Netherlands and a deeply distorted sense of lives worth living. We hear from progressive people all the time that an important political issue today is dying with dignity, right? That's the phrase that accompanies a regime like the Netherlands, and it's a phrase that is a part of American politics today. And think about just what an extraordinarily horrible, indecent, obscene phrase that is. It means that right now, if we were to go to Memorial or to St. Joe and look at some people in the intensive care ward, we're supposed to think of some of them as lacking in dignity. What they need is a law to let them die in a better and more dignified way. So the context in which we live is one in which the fundamental culture is so askew. I don't know whether it's pagan or something worse, but it's certainly not one in which the simple vindication of the facts about human life is going to be sufficient to build the culture of life. There are some bright spots, so I want to set a little bit of different context. There's a lot more going for us than just the linear arguments we sometimes think. Quite recently, you might have seen, if you read, as I'm sure you all do from cover to cover, the New York Times every day, a favorable review by a pro-choice reviewer of a book called Defenders of the Unborn. And again, I just will read a couple of paragraphs or a couple of sentences from this author, not someone who is known to me before, Kristen Dombeck. She puts her New York Times bona fides right before us at the start. Among those of us who wish to protect access to abortion, it's easy to feel that the right to life language is a cover for an attack on feminism. It's a feeling supported by a common story about history. The anti-abortion movement began after Roe versus Wade because conservative evangelicals were threatened by women's newfound power over their bodies. What else could explain the movement's swift rise in the decade following the Supreme Court decision, if not a widespread reaction against equal rights? But to tell the story a different way, historian Daniel Williams argues it is to ignore the long history of the movement to limit abortion, to discount the motives expressed for nearly half a century by those in the movement. In Defenders of the Unborn, a deeply researched, even-handed, accessible, and surprising history of anti-abortion activism before Roe versus Wade, Williams give us the activists' beliefs in their own words. And this author is surprised to learn that the earliest and strongest voices in the pro-life movement were physicians. Indeed, they were Catholic physicians. There's no question that the earliest and strongest, most organized elements of the pro-life movement in this country were Catholic, not a fact about which I presume most people in this room will be troubled, though it contributed in some ways early on to a difficulty in the movement taking a foothold. You may recall from your study of history that the candidacy of John F. Kennedy for president wasn't particularly well received across the country, and part of the resistance to the pro-life movement was a standard resistance to popery. I don't mean by that a refreshing cinnamon scent for your room, right? Early people who joined the Catholics for sensible reasons were the Black Panthers, about whom you might have seen much in the news of late. And why would that be? Because people associated the movement toward liberalizing abortion laws, which is what the movement was in the decades before Roe versus Wade, with a sense of wanting to control the population. It was part and parcel of the ugly early 20th century United States dalliance in many elite circles with eugenics. And so it shouldn't surprise us, if we think about it on reflection, that this was a movement that was, to use the self-styled term of the day, progressive. It was a movement that cared about the poor and the marginalized. It was not a movement that was against women. It was a movement in favor of them. Hugh Hefner was one of the leading early advocates of the liberalization of abortion laws. Hugh Hefner is a name the older people in the room will remember. He's the founder of Playboy magazine. And Playboy magazine was always about more than the pictures, actually. It was about the Playboy lifestyle. It was about the decoupling of any sort of moral strictures, which includes any connection to life, of people's sexual liberty, right? Which remains at the heart, right, of this dispute. And so people who cared about the vindication of women in the early days of arguments about the liberalization of abortion laws didn't think that Hugh Hefner had their best interests in heart. Indeed, abortion is a men's liberation movement. It's one extra way that men won't have to worry about the consequences of choices they made. And the earliest polling showed clearly that men were more strongly pro-choice than women in the early days of this movement. It's a point that our colleague and friend David O'Connor made to me when I gave a talk about some of these issues a year ago. Abortion is and always has been a backup means of birth control for this country. And when that's true, then what we're dealing with when we deal with people who say they're pro-choice is more than the logical problem of people not understanding what's at stake. It's the deeper problem of original sin and a kind of collective desire to say, well, ideally, I'll never need to make recourse to this. But given all the givens, I want the option. But just as that forgotten history might seem surprising to us, it should seem surprising in a good way. There are so many elements of the gospel of life that should be able to achieve broader consensus and broader support from people. And so I've already gone on too long, but the only way that I wanted to conclude was to think about those positive elements, those elements of beauty that will always be with us when what we are proclaiming is a gospel of life. I began by saying that we're here in Lent and we're trying to aim toward life. And it's worth saying, but it's sort of the most basic thing we could say about what it is to be Christian, to be a responder to the Word of God. The Word of God comes to us in the sacred scriptures, first in the book of Genesis, with the story of creation. The beginning of life is the beginning of our encounter with the Word of God, most of us. We think in a linear fashion, and we think about creation. And at the heart of the beautiful stories of creation is the gift of life. And all of that for Christians is a story, the story of scriptures, right? The arc of salvation history. It's the story of life, of the way sin imperils life, and of the way Jesus redeems and restores life at Easter. And so the Christian story, the scriptural story, is thoroughly about life. It is a thread of life from beginning to eternity, which isn't quite end, except, I suppose, in the Aristotelian sense. And then when we think about this surprising and forgotten history, this progressive history of what it is to be pro-life, we realize the point that Professor Sneed makes in so many ways and so often to us, that more than a logical argument, what we need is to expand the moral imagination, except that point didn't originate with Carter Sneed. It goes back at least to the following story. You need to love your neighbor as yourself, said Jesus. And someone said, well, who's my neighbor? And they were hoping, believe me, for a short list. And the answer turned the question on its head. There was no list given. There were no properties given, except the following property. Our neighbor is whom we love. And so we knew that the Good Samaritan was neighbor because he loved, right? He didn't need to find a set of criteria in his neighbor. He was neighbor because he loved. It was a positive invitation, and an endless one, if not an end, except, I suppose, in the Aristotelian sense of an end. And there we can see that the expanding of the pro-life message as a feminist message, the expansion of the pro-life message as a message about seeing every race as being of equal dignity, is a lot to grow on and a lot to build on. Indeed, to think about that is sort of to wake up on a bad day and notice that that horrible storm that had come the day before had left the trees and the quad looking particularly beautiful. It may be that someone unattractive is going to win this election in November. Many of us will pay a lot of attention to that. I know I'll pay too much attention to it for my own good and the good of those around me. Let's just imagine the worst happens, right? And that 5 Supreme Court appointments are made by this person, and it looks impossible for generations that the Supreme Court is going to be the agent of change here. We might just feel like a group of disciples felt as they cowered in an upper room, knowing they had betrayed the Lord, believing he was dead, not knowing what to do. He appeared in their midst, in the face of their betrayal, with knowledge of their fear and their vulnerability, and said simply this: "Peace be with you." The Christian story is not a story of U.S. politics, as important as U.S. politics can sometimes be for Christians trying to live the Christian life well. The Christian story is not a story about the election of 2016. The gospel of life is not a gospel of life merely or mostly for 2016 or 1116 or 3016. The gospel of life is about the God who ever is, who ever was, a beauty ever ancient, ever new, who breathed life into us and who invites us to life for eternity, for Easter, which is not an end. And so, having thrown some ugly stories at you, some bad possibilities, as we gather in this upper room, do know that I can say sincerely and optimistically and joyfully, peace be with you.